You start playing and they show you the song, and I start thinking, I'm playing with the Stones. And I'm well chuffed, But for me, it wasn't. It went the other way. It was like, wow.
The music industry is built on a lie. We see artist names on album covers and assume those artists crafted every track.
He's a poet, and I'm sort of songwriter, so we're in the same area, And really what happened, we just ended up having 5 years of great conversations, which we taped. So someone's had the horrible job of transcribing them all.
But some of the most iconic songs came from ghostwriters like Paul McCartney, who transformed music history by willingly letting others take the credit for songs he wrote. Today, we're digging into the secret catalog that Paul McCartney gave away, traded to his competitors, or hid behind totally fake names that completely reshaped music history. How did we all collectively miss this? The night Paul McCartney saved his biggest rivals. When most people think about Paul McCartney, they think about Beatles classics, sold-out stadiums, and one of the most successful careers in music history. What they do not realize is that some of his most fascinating works were never released under his own name. While most songwriters protect their best material, Paul often did the opposite. Time and time again, he handed great songs to other artists, helping launch careers, create hit records, and shape the sound of an entire era. Now, the first song on our list involves a band you would never expect to take a song from a Beatle. Paul placed one of his best ideas into the hands of the very band trying to challenge the Beatles' throne. And what happened next helped shape the future of rock music. When you think of rock legends who sell out stadiums, dominate world tours, and define the entire rebellious spirit of music, you think of the Rolling Stones. But back in 1963, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were just another young band struggling to make a name for themselves in London. Yes, their live shows were gaining attention, and audiences loved their blues sound, but they were yet to get their big break. The band was still struggling to get a hit song they could call their own. And at the time, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards had not yet developed into the songwriting partnership the world would eventually know. Most nights, they performed songs written by other artists, and their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, knew that could only take them so far. If the Stones wanted to survive, they needed a hit record they could truly call their own. Fortunately, one afternoon, while walking through London, Oldham spotted John Lennon and Paul McCartney getting out of a taxi. He knew this was a chance he could not afford to miss. At the time, the Beatles were already becoming the biggest name in British music, so Oldham walked over and explained the situation. The Rolling Stones desperately needed a hit record if they were going to take the next step in their career. Paul listened and immediately thought of a song idea he had been working on called "I Wanna Be Your Man." The Beatles were not planning to build a major release around it, so rather than let it sit unfinished, Paul offered it to the Stones. It was a simple gesture at the time, but it would end up changing the future of one of the biggest bands in rock history. Now, not long afterward, John and Paul showed up at a rehearsal where the Rolling Stones were practicing. And what happened next stayed with the band for the rest of their lives. Sitting in the corner of the room, Lennon and McCartney started shaping the song right in front of them. They traded lines, adjusted lyrics, worked out the structure, and finished the track as if it were nothing. For Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, it was eye-opening. Before then, songwriting had seemed like some mysterious talent that only a handful of people possessed. Yet here were two young musicians building a song from scratch almost as casually as having a conversation. The Rolling Stones took the song into the studio and made it their own. They added a rougher edge, leaned into their blues influences, and gave it a tougher sound than the Beatles' version. When the record was released later that year, it surprisingly became their first major hit, reaching the British top 10 and helping introduce them to a much wider audience. But the chart success was only part of the story. Years later, Keith Richards admitted that watching Lennon and McCartney work on that song changed the way he thought about music. It showed him that great songs were not created by magic. They were created by people willing to sit down, put in the work, and trust their ideas. This realization gave both Richards and Jagger the confidence to start writing themselves, even though Rolling Stone would end up being the Beatles' greatest rival. This is still remarkable, because Paul McCartney did not just hand another band a hit single. He helped give the Rolling Stones the belief that they could become songwriters in their own right. The rivalry between them would go on to shape an entire era of music. Yet one of the sparks that helped start it all came from a song Paul was willing to give away. But while Paul was busy building the careers of his fiercest competitors, the 60-minute ultimatum. When you listen to the finished version of Come and Get It, it sounds like the kind of polished pop song that would take days, if not weeks, to create. But the real story behind the making of that song will leave you stunned. You see, Paul McCartney wrote, recorded, arranged, and produced it in a single hour. By the time most musicians would still be working out the details, Paul had already finished the entire song. Now, to understand how this happened, you have to look at where Paul was in 1969. To the world, the Beatles still looked unstoppable. They were the biggest band in the world and seemed to be sitting comfortably at the top of the music industry. But behind the scenes, things were very different. Business disagreements, creative tensions, and years of constant pressure were taking their toll. The atmosphere around the band had become strained, and everyone could feel it. However, Paul's creativity never seemed to slow down. No matter what was happening around him, songs just kept coming. On the morning of July 24, 1969, Paul arrived at the studio before the rest of the band. With some free studio time on his hands and a melody already forming in his mind, he decided to put the time to good use. Rather than sit around waiting for John, George, and Ringo, he started building a new song from scratch. He began at the piano, working out the chords and structure. From there, he moved to the drums, laying down the rhythm before picking up a bass guitar and recording the bass line. After that, he added vocals and filled in the remaining parts. Piece by piece, the song came together. By the time the other Beatles arrived, Paul had already completed a full demo. What had started as an idea in his head had become a finished recording in less than 60 minutes. But here's the thing, Paul never planned to release the song himself. Instead, he had another group in mind. At the time, a young Welsh band called Badfinger had recently signed to Apple Records, the label owned by the Beatles. They had talent and potential, but they were struggling to find the hit that could introduce them to a wider audience. Paul believed Come and Get It could be that song. But Paul gave them one condition when he played the demo for Badfinger. He made it clear that he did not want them to reinvent it. If they wanted the song, they had to record it exactly the way he had written it. The arrangement, the tempo, the feel, and even the vocal delivery had to stay the same. In other words, they were being handed a hit, but they had to trust Paul's instincts completely. For a young band trying to establish itself, it was not a difficult decision. They knew an opportunity like this did not come along every day. Instead of arguing for creative control, they followed Paul's blueprint exactly as he requested. They learned the song, recorded it, and stayed remarkably close to the original demo. Fortunately, the gamble paid off. When Come and Get It was released later that year, it became a major hit and gave Badfinger the breakthrough they had been searching for. The song climbed the charts around the world and helped turn them into one of Apple Records' most successful bands. For Paul McCartney, creating a hit song often seemed effortless. But while he was casually giving away melodies that other artists would have killed to keep, his next masterpiece would face a brutal rejection from his own bandmate, forcing the track into hiding. The song, John Lennon laughed at. When the Beatles were at the peak of their careers, Paul McCartney was living in a world that rarely slowed down. Wherever the Beatles went, crowds gathered, cameras followed, and privacy became almost impossible for them. While the band's success opened doors that most musicians could only dream about, it also created a constant level of pressure that was difficult to escape. Now, away from the media attention, Paul found a silent refuge in a small attic room at the London home of his girlfriend at the time, Jane Asher. It was a small space with a piano and enough peace for him to think. Whenever the pressure of fame became overwhelming, he would head upstairs, sit at the piano, and lose himself in music. And it was in this attic room that a melody slowly began to take shape. From the moment he started working on it, Paul felt there was something special about the song. It was very different from the upbeat, energetic records the Beatles were releasing at the time. This one was softer, more reflective, and carried a sense of longing that immediately caught his attention. The more he played it, the more attached he became to it. What began as a simple idea on a piano gradually grew into a song he genuinely believed could connect with people on a deeper level. By the time he finished it, Paul was convinced he had written something worth fighting for. He eventually decided to play the song for John Lennon. John was not only Paul's closest creative partner but also his bandmate in the Beatles and one of the most influential songwriters of his generation. The two had built their songwriting partnership on brutal honesty, and neither of them was known for sugarcoating an opinion. This was exactly why Paul's judgment mattered to John, and John's judgment mattered to Paul. If a song could impress his partner, it had a good chance of making it onto a Beatles record. So, feeling confident about what he had created, Paul sat down and played the song. But the reaction was not what he expected. The moment he sang the opening line, "Please lock me away," John reportedly started laughing. Instead of hearing a future hit, he heard a song that felt far too sentimental for the Beatles. To him, it lacked the bite, confidence, and attitude that had become such an important part of the band's sound. The reaction was a tough blow for Paul, and for a while it seemed the song's journey had come to an end. Since John had no interest in recording it with the Beatles, Paul put it aside and turned his attention to other projects. But around that same time, Jane Asher's brother, Peter Asher, found himself facing a problem of his own. He had recently formed a duo called Peter and Gordon, and although they had landed a recording contract, they still lacked the one thing every new artist desperately needed: a strong debut single. Knowing the situation they were in, Paul reached back into his notebook and offered them the very song that had been rejected by the Beatles. The name of this song was A World Without Love. Interestingly, this decision turned out to change everything. When Peter and Gordon released the single in early 1964, listeners immediately connected with it. The melody that had been rejected as too soft suddenly found an audience that loved exactly what made it different. Before long, the record climbed to number 1 in Britain, and then repeated the feat in the United States. For Paul, the success of A World Without Love was about more than proving John Lennon wrong. It showed him that a song could have a life of its own. Even after being rejected by the person whose opinion mattered most to him, the track went on to connect with millions of listeners around the world. But the experience also left him thinking about something he had never seriously questioned before. If a discarded McCartney song could become a worldwide hit that topped charts, how many other hidden gems were sitting in his notebook, waiting for the right moment? The secret identity of Bernard Webb. By 1966, the Beatles had become so famous that their name alone could sell out stadiums. Their records sold in huge numbers, radio stations played their songs non-stop, and anything connected to the band seemed to turn into a success. While this might sound like every musician's dream, it left Paul McCartney with a question he could not shake. Were people responding to the songs themselves? Or were they simply responding to the name McCartney on the record? If he released a song without anyone knowing he had written it, would it still succeed? The more he considered it, the more he wanted an honest answer. Around that time, he had written a ballad called Woman, and he believed it was strong enough to succeed on its own. So instead of attaching his famous name to it, Paul decided to try something unusual. When the song was prepared for release, the songwriting credit did not read Paul McCartney. Instead, it belonged to someone nobody had ever heard of, Bernard Webb. To make the experiment work, Paul kept his involvement completely secret. He gave the song to Peter and Gordon and asked them not to tell anyone where it had come from. As far as the public knew, Bernard Webb was a real songwriter. Some reports even claimed he was a young musician living abroad who had somehow landed a recording deal. Meanwhile, Paul stayed in the background, watching closely to see what would happen when one of his songs entered the world without any connection to the Beatles. This experiment gave him the answer he had been looking for. When Woman was released in early 1966, radio stations quickly picked it up, and listeners responded to it almost immediately. The melody connected with people, the record began climbing the charts, and sales continued to grow. Most of the people buying it had no idea Paul McCartney was involved. They simply liked the song and wanted to hear it again. Before long, a few music critics began to suspect that Bernard Webb was not who he claimed to be. Some noticed similarities between the songwriting style and the melodies Paul was known for. Eventually, the truth came out, and the public learned that the mysterious songwriter was actually one of the most famous musicians in the world. By then, however, the point had already been proven. For Paul, that mattered more than another chart success. The experiment showed him that his songs could do well on their own, even without the Beatles attached to them. It confirmed that people were connecting with the music itself, not just the name on the record sleeve. What began as a simple question had turned into one of the most unusual experiments of his career, and it gave him a level of confidence that no chart position ever could. But while this experiment was driven by curiosity, his next memorable collaboration came from something far more personal and would be shaped by a heartbreaking family story. Hiding a tragedy inside a pop song. Years after experimenting with secret songwriting credits, Paul McCartney found himself looking for a new creative challenge. By the late 80s, he had already achieved more success than most musicians could ever imagine. He was no longer trying to prove he could write hit songs. Instead, he was looking for collaborators who could push him in new directions. One of the most unexpected people to do that was Elvis Costello. At first glance, the partnership did not make much sense. Paul was known for his gift for melody and his ability to write songs that connected with huge audiences. Costello, on the other hand, had built his reputation on sharp lyrics and a more edgy style. Yet when the two sat down together with acoustic guitars, they quickly discovered they shared a natural creative chemistry. During one of their early writing sessions, Costello played Paul an unfinished song inspired by his grandmother, who was living with Alzheimer's disease. The story behind it was deeply personal, but Costello was struggling to move it forward. The music reflected the sadness of the subject, and while it was powerful, he was not sure how to shape it into something that could reach a wider audience. As Paul listened, he suggested a different approach. Over the years, he had learned that some of the most emotional songs are not the ones that sound sad. Sometimes a bright melody can make a painful story hit even harder. Instead of leaning further into the darkness, he thought the song should move in the opposite direction. The two began rebuilding it from the ground up. Paul came up with a lively bass line that immediately changed the feel of the track. Little by little, the song evolved into an upbeat pop record. The contrast was intentional. The music would sound hopeful and inviting, while the lyrics would carry the emotional weight. The finished song was called Veronica. At first listen, it sounds cheerful and energetic, the kind of song that feels perfectly at home on the radio. But beneath the catchy melody is a heartbreaking story about an elderly woman whose memories are slowly fading away. As her world grows smaller, she struggles to recognize the people around her and spends more time lost in memories from long ago. The song captures the sadness of watching someone disappear piece by piece while still being physically present. It was a subject that resonated with Paul as well, having seen the effects of memory loss within his own family. When Veronica was released in 1989, it became Elvis Costello's biggest hit in the United States. Millions of people were drawn to its melody, often without realizing the emotional story hidden beneath it. Once again, Paul showed that a great song can do more than entertain. It can help people connect with feelings that are often difficult to put into words. But while Paul was helping turn a painful family story into a memorable hit, his next hidden gift would be even more personal, taking him back to Liverpool and someone he had known long before the world knew his name. The gift to the girl in the cloakroom. To find the story behind the final hidden masterpiece in Paul McCartney's secret catalog, we need to leave the recording studios behind and head back to Liverpool, the city where his journey began. The song was titled "Step Inside Love," and for years it became one of the most recognizable melodies on British television. Millions of viewers heard it every week as the opening theme for Cilla Black's popular television show. But behind that familiar tune was a much more personal story. For Paul, this was not just another song. It was a chance to help an old friend who had been there long before fame, fortune, and Beatlemania changed their lives. To understand why the song meant so much to him, you have to go back to the early days of Liverpool's music scene. At the center of it all was the Cavern Club, a crowded basement venue where young musicians dreamed of being discovered. It was loud, packed with people, and filled with the energy of a city obsessed with music. Among those working there was a teenage girl named Cilla Black. She was not a singer with a recording contract or a rising star with industry connections. Most nights, she worked in the cloakroom, collecting coats, handing out tickets, and helping customers find their belongings after the show. It was not exactly the best job, but it kept her close to the music she loved and the people who would soon change her life. Now, what made Cilla different was her voice. Whenever she had the opportunity, she would step away from the cloakroom and sing with local musicians. Before long, people started noticing that she had real talent. Paul McCartney noticed it too. The Beatles were performing regularly at the Cavern Club during those years, and they got to know Cilla well. They spent countless hours talking backstage, joking around between performances, and sharing the excitement of being young people chasing impossible dreams. To Paul, she was never some future celebrity. She was simply a friend from Liverpool. As the years passed, both their lives changed dramatically. The Beatles became the biggest band in the world, while Cilla built a successful music career of her own. Eventually, she was given her own television show by the British Broadcasting Corporation. It was a major opportunity, but it also came with pressure. A weekly television show needed an opening song that audiences would instantly recognize. Cilla wanted something special, something that felt personal rather than manufactured. And this is where Paul stepped in. Instead of giving her an old song that had been sitting unused in a notebook, he decided to write something specifically for her. He wanted the song to match her personality and make viewers feel welcome the moment the show began. The result was Step Inside Love. It was warm, friendly, and inviting. Rather than trying to impress people with flashy arrangements, the song felt like a conversation between friends. Paul cared enough about the project that he became involved beyond simply writing the song. He spent time helping Cilla learn it and worked with her on the performance. Imagine that for a moment. One of the most famous musicians on the planet was sitting in a television studio with an acoustic guitar, helping an old friend prepare for her show. Despite everything he had achieved, Paul had never forgotten where he came from or the people who were there before the fame arrived. When Step Inside Love was released in 1968, it quickly became a hit. More importantly, it became closely tied to Cilla herself. Week after week, viewers heard the song as they tuned into her program, and before long, it became part of British popular culture. What started as a favor between friends ended up becoming one of the defining songs of her career. Looking back, that may be the most remarkable part of the story. Paul McCartney could have focused entirely on his own success. Instead, he repeatedly used his songwriting talent to help other people find theirs. Whether it was a struggling band, a longtime friend, or even a future rival, he seemed to find genuine satisfaction in opening doors for others. Step Inside Love was more than just another song. It was proof that even at the height of global fame, Paul still remembered the girl who once looked after coats in a Liverpool basement. The true worth of a melody. When you look at all these songs together, something really interesting starts to stand out. We spend so much time talking about Paul McCartney as one of the biggest stars in music history that it is easy to focus only on the records he made famous. We picture the sold-out stadiums, the screaming fans, and the endless list of hit songs. But behind all of that was a songwriter who seemed to have more ideas than he could ever use on his own. Most artists guard their best work carefully. If they write a great song, they keep it because there is always the fear that another one might not come along. Paul never seemed to think that way. Time and time again, he wrote something special and handed it to somebody else. Sometimes it was a friend who needed a hit. Sometimes it was a young artist searching for a breakthrough. And sometimes it was simply someone he believed in. That choice ended up shaping music history in ways most listeners never realized. One song helped launch a career. Another gave an artist confidence at exactly the right moment. A different melody became part of somebody's life for decades. One small decision in a writing room could create a ripple effect that lasts for generations. Mind you, the songs we have talked about here are only half of the story. The list of songs Paul McCartney gave away goes much deeper than most people realize. He gave Mary Hopkin, Goodbye, Rod Stewart, Mine for Me, and Carlos Mendes, Penina. Then, decades later, he was still doing the same thing, working with Rihanna and Kanye West on 4-5 Seconds. What is fascinating is how little has changed over all those years. The artists were different, and the music industry had evolved, yet Paul kept doing what he had always done. When he believed in a song, he was willing to let someone else take it and make it their own. He never seemed concerned with collecting every accolade for himself. He cared about where the music could go next. Maybe that is the true worth of a melody. It is not measured by who sings it first or whose name appears on the record sleeve. It is measured by how far it travels and how many lives it touches along the way. When most people think about Paul McCartney, they think about Beatles classics and sold-out arenas. Yet some of his most fascinating work happened behind the scenes, inside songs that carried somebody else's name. And in many ways, that tells you everything you need to know about him. He was not just a performer. He was a songwriter whose music was simply too big to belong to one voice alone. And perhaps that leaves us with one final thought. Is the greatest song ever written the one that makes its creator famous, or the one that quietly changes someone else's life forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.